Module 4.1. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to take a look at the War of 1812. How was the War of 1812 the second war for American independence? Focus questions. Here we go. I want one argument against, or one argument for the U.S. involvement in the War of 1812, one argument against the U.S. involvement in the War of 1812, and which argument is stronger and why. So we're focusing on argumentation skills today. So let's kind of recap here, okay? What we have to kind of put together, what we have to understand, there is a straight line that can be drawn from the Washington administration and the Proclamation of Neutrality straight through to the War of 1812. And that is the French Revolution. The French Revolution drew in every major power of Europe. And it was essentially a gigantic fight between Britain and France. And Britain and France are the two world superpowers at that time. They are going to try to drag everybody into it. The United States almost got dragged into it several times because of our signing of the peace agreement, our friendship pact with France back from 1777. And we have to remember that the French tried to hold us to that. There's going to be different points of view in the country. You had the Federalists who were Anglophiles, who leaned more towards England, and then you had the Republicans who were Francophiles, who leaned more towards the Democrats, or the French. So basically, the nation's going to be divided in terms of who do we support, how do we support them, and why. And the War of 1812 is when we just could not stay neutral in this engagement any longer. Think about the extents to which we stayed neutral. You had the XYZ affair, you had Citizen Ghent, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Embargo Act. All of these are different attempts in the United States to stay neutral and to try to figure out ways around getting involved with this stuff. That's what Washington was warning about in his farewell address. But it's going to be in 1812 when we finally get involved. So let's see why. All right. It is James Madison's presidency. James Madison was the Secretary of State. James Madison was the Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, and after Jefferson serves his 2 terms in 1808, he is elected to be the 4th President of the United States. So James Madison is the 4th President of the United States. He's got some interesting views. He is a Democratic Republican, but he was a co-author in the Federalist Papers. So he does believe that there is some argument for a strong constitution, a strong federal government. But he is not going to be the figure that Thomas Jefferson was. Thomas Jefferson was a giant figure, and Thomas Jefferson was able to dominate Congress when he was in power. That's how he was able to get the Embargo Act passed. So Madison is going to be a different animal, and he's going to have to kind of deal with a lot of people in Congress. So he was able to get Congress to pass the Non-Intercourse Act in 1809. It's not that kind of intercourse, Muhammad. Okay, we're talking about, basically this is a watered-down Embargo Act, okay? And it only applies to Britain and France. It doesn't apply to everybody who's fighting in the war. So that's going to be one thing that's going to be able to get passed. Basically, he's going to realize that the embargo was no good for the country and they need something a little bit different. But things are going to come to a head very quickly. Congress, once Jefferson is gone, is going to come up and they're going to pass Macon's Bill number 2. Bacon's Bill number 2 was a complete disapproval of the embargo and basically completely ended the embargo. Macon's bill said that if either Britain or France repealed their commercial restrictions, then the U.S. would trade with them. So it was kind of like, we want to trade with you, just one of you has to basically pull it up. So in 1810, Napoleon took a look at that and said, okay. So he declared that he would lift his as long as Britain did it too. And basically what he was doing is he's trying to maneuver the Americans into keeping their embargo against the British and basically declaring their support with France even though that's not what the Congress's intention was. But this is going to force an international confrontation because it puts us into a difficult position. Who do we support in this battle? This is a question that the country has been trying to avoid and we've been trying to stay out of. All right, so enter the war hawks. In Congress, we have a new generation of congressmen. All right, so, 1812, 1790, we're talking more than 20 years. Some of the old guard are starting to retire. We got some new younger guys coming in. And those younger guys had not fought in the Revolutionary War, and they want some piece of that glory for themselves. A lot of these guys are from the South and from the West, areas that had not been fighting directly in the Revolution. And basically, they've got some ambition. They want to see, they want to have glory. They want to have their own war. And they also want to push the Indians further west. They want more land in the West. So the way they see it is war hawks. All right, the way they see it is war is good. There was a Native American leader, Tecumseh, who led an anti-white settler rebellion in Indiana, and he was trying to establish an Indian confederacy. One of the heroes that comes out of this is the governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, who gathered an army to defeat Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1813. And Harrison is going to use that when he runs for president, and that's where we get Old Tippecanoe from. We'll get to that later. All right, so let's get back to the problems with Britain. The British are arming the Indians. The Warhawks, they knew we had problems with the Warhawks, and also Britain is always trying to do something to destabilize us because they were never too happy the fact that we had our independence in the first place. They were still on our western frontier. They were still on our northern frontier. So the British are helping out the Indians, trying to arm them against us. That's one thing that's going on. The British also never completely left some forts that we had, and that also angered us. On top of that, you had the Warhawks beating their drums, saying we got to go to war with these Indians, and you know what? Let's go to war with Britain too. And you know what? We'll invade Canada, and the Canadians will be so happy to have us there that they'll join in the war too, and the Canadians will come join us, and then we'll be all one big happy family. Basically, there was just too much pressure going on. In Madison saw the U.S. as being pushed around too much. Basically, the British were impressing our sailors. So there was a thing where the British Navy would come up to an American ship, and they would go and they would take the ship and take the sailors and say, "You now sail for us." And it was just they were kind of slapping us around. So it did not go over too well. And on June 1st, 1812, basically Madison had had enough. He kind of went in with the Warhawks, and he asked Congress for a declaration of war against the British. Notice the check and balance here. The president cannot declare war. He must ask Congress to declare war, which they did. So on June 1st, 1812, the United States declares war on Britain. All right, support comes from the South and the West. The North, they were mainly Federalist. Oops. The North were mainly Federalist, and they were siding with England. They were Anglophiles. They sided with Britain. The Federalists are not happy. They were very near treason a lot of times during the War of 1812. And some states even refused to give over the militias to go into the army because they basically saw this as a war that was not their war. This was a Democratic Republican war. This was a Warhawk war. This was not a Federalist war. So a lot of the Northerners are going to be very upset. Gets the nickname Mr. Madison's War because it happens during the Madison administration. All right, let's talk about Canada. The first thing that we tried to do was go and take over Canada. Boy, oh boy, did that fail. We basically had an army together. They were not trained. They were not drilled. We got to remember we let our army basically dwindle down to nothing after the Revolution, so now we're trying to put an army back together. And our entire plan was we're going to go up into Canada, and the Canadians are going to be so thrilled to see the Americans there that they're going to join up, overthrow the British overlords, and we're all going to go around singing Kumbaya together. That didn't happen. We got up there, and our army is like, "Hey, Canada, aren't you glad to see us?" And the Canadians started shooting at us because, no, they weren't. Canadians actually liked being part of the British Empire, and the Canadians are going to be part of the British Empire until the 1960s. Okay, We tried to launch an invasion of Montreal, did not work. The Canadians joined to fight against the Americans, and they resisted several invasions. The one thing that did come out of here was we had Oliver Hazard Perry, who was a naval commander, and he was able to keep control of Lake Erie, fighting off a British force on the Great Lakes. So that means we did not lose sea power, because if we lost the Great Lakes to the British, they would have sailed down the Mississippi River, divided the United States, and we would have been done in. And very quickly, the instances in Canada just kind of illustrated what problems that we were dealing with. Okay, by 1814, the United States, we were completely on the defensive, and we're just trying to hold back a British invasion. One of the only things that we had going for us for a long time was Napoleon was occupying the major bulk of the British forces, but Napoleon had been taken care of by late 1812 after he invaded Russia. So he was temporarily forced into exile, and basically the British were able to shift their forces over here, and that was not good for us. We were barely able to stop the British from invading New York on Lake Champlain. And then in August of 1814, the British invaded the Chesapeake Bay. They took over Washington, D.C., and they set fire to the city, including burning the White House to the ground. So the White House that we have now is actually a rebuilt White House, because the original White House was burned down after the War of 1812. Americans are barely able to hold on in Fort Baltimore to prevent the invasion from going further. And it's at the invasion of Fort Baltimore that Francis Scott Key, who was a soldier at the time, basically uses the experience to write what we now know as the Star-Spangled Banner. So we were really doing everything we can just to kind of hold on to dear life. All right, there is one battle that actually did go pretty well for us, and that was the Battle of New Orleans. New Orleans is the major American port on the Mississippi River. It is on the Gulf of Mexico. It is critically important because New Orleans is the control of the Mississippi River, which divides the country east from west. Andrew Jackson was the American general who was fighting to stop the British, and Jackson was an Indian fighter. All right, he had started by fighting in the west. He was from Tennessee, by fighting in the Tennessee frontier to basically push the Indians back so the white settlers could go and take over that fine farmland. And he was in charge of the American force at New Orleans. The British were overconfident after the recent string of victories, so they launched a frontal assault against Jackson. And Jackson was able, with lesser numbers, to pull off an astonishing victory against the British. And Jackson instantly becomes a national hero. Now, interestingly enough, this is in January of 1815. When that happened, the war was already over. Excuse me. You see, communication was a lot slower back then. So Russia was fearful of France and basically Napoleon was escaping from exile and about to make his grand comeback. So the Russians were able to work with the British and the French, or the British and the U.S., to work out a peace deal. And this comes in the Belgian city of Ghent. And we get the Treaty of Ghent from this. Basically, the Treaty of Ghent ended the war pretty much exactly where it began. We neither gained land nor we lost land. It was a stalemate. But the British agreed to pull out of the areas that they were in, and we were basically left alive. And this happened on the December 24th, 1814, which was a couple of weeks before the Battle of New Orleans. They hadn't received word yet that the war was over. Now, just as in anything, the Federalists in the North, though, had been pushing an envelope because they were seriously not happy with what was going on. So what we have happening is known as the Hartford Convention. So a lot of the Federalists were so concerned with what was happening in with the British that in the embargo and the fact that they were losing all their money, and a lot of the Federalists were actually supporting Britain, that they decided to take some action. So you have a bunch of New England states meeting in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. You had Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont. And they all go to Hartford, Connecticut in December of 1814, and they were discussing their grievances over the war. This is one of those instances, much like the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where once you let something out of the bag, it cannot go back in. So they start having some talk about succession. Succession is when a state leaves the Union. So they start talking about that. Not a good thing. They demanded financial assistance from Washington because the Federalist economy the New England economy was entirely built on trade, and trade was cut off during the war, so they demanded money. They proposed constitutional amendments requiring a 2/3 of a vote before an embargo could be declared. And new state also, they required 2/3 of a vote before new states could be amended or war is declared, because they were so upset the way that this war and this embargo was passed over their objections. They also wanted to abolish the Three-Fifths Clause to eliminate Southern representation advantages from the Constitution, and they wanted to limit presidents to one term and make it so two successive presidents could not be from the same state, because during this time we were dealing with what was called the Virginia Dynasty. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison all came from Virginia. So there was concern that basically the South had a lockhold on government and that they were not relinquishing control of the government. So all of this is going on, and basically at Hartford there's talk of nullification, there's talk of succession, and it's just not going very well for the country. So our country was really divided by this War of 1812, even though we kind of lucked out and were able to get out with our independence and sovereignty intact. So let's go back here. We want one argument for the U.S. in the War of 1812, one argument against the U.S. in the War of 1812, and which argument is stronger and why. All right, so that's your question for tomorrow, and then tomorrow we are going to discuss the War of 1812, and we're going to specifically focus on partisanship, looking at the Hartford Convention, comparing it with Kentucky and Virginia. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email. All right, everybody, have a good day.